Hey there, this is Chris Harper from hiredgun.tech and welcome to the first video of a mini series on creating some cool looking buttons using Microsoft Power Apps. In this first session, we'll explore how we can use the considerable capability of HTML and inline CSS, and in later videos, I'll take it to the next level to demo how we can animate Power Apps buttons and create some really striking effects. Now, as often the case with Power Apps, it's not as difficult as it first looks. All the buttons you see on screen have been created with a maximum of 3 lines of CSS, and just small tweaks to the CSS parameters produce very different effects. So let's go ahead and create the red button at the bottom of the screen using a HTML text box and CSS. So first of all, I'm going to insert a HTML text box. Let's just drag that down, and I'm going to make the width 300 pixels and the height 200 pixels and change all the padding to 0. And then the next stage is to take this HTML and CSS here and to paste it directly into the text box. And straight away you get to see the effect of introducing that CSS. We've got a background gradient running from the bottom up to the top, red to blue. So let's look at that CSS in a bit more detail. Now, the first and last lines are simply HTML defining a container in which to display the inline CSS. So whatever else you change with this CSS code, leave the first and last lines as they are. Now let's look at the 3 lines of CSS. Now here we have the height function for CSS, and it's currently specified at 250 pixels, whereas down here we've specified the height of the HTML text box to be 200, and that's why we have this scroll bar. So we need to change this value, but what we don't do is make it 200 because that actually retains the scroll bar. If we make it too small, for example, if I change that to 180, then we get white space. So we need to change that to 199 so it fits perfectly. So always have the height 1 pixel less than the height you've specified for the HTML text box. Now the border radius on the second line of CSS works in exactly the same way that the border radius does within Power Apps. So what we're going to do here is go straight in and change the bottom 2 radius to 120. To give a nice curve effect. Now the third line, the linear gradient line of CSS, has 2 parameters. The first specifies the direction of the gradient, and at the moment it's 0 degrees, so it goes from the bottom to the top, but we can change that. We can make that 45, so it goes from bottom left to top right, or we can make it 180. So it completely inverts, but actually in this case I'm going to make it 90 degrees so it runs from left to right. Now the second parameter of the linear gradient line of CSS is the color of the gradient itself, and you see here I've specified red and blue, which gives us that gradient. Now here I'm using the base color palette, but I'm not limited to that, so I can actually use hex colors or RGB colors. So if I copy the hex for blue and paste that back in, you'll see that works just as well, and I can do exactly the same for the RGB. I just need to prefix that with RGB, and then that works perfectly as well. Now, what I'm going to do here is actually increase the number of tiers. I mentioned the minimum you need is 2 tiers, but actually you can increase that to any amount of color tiers that you want to use. Obviously, the more you use, the busier the HTML box and CSS looks. But I'm going to increase this to 4. So I just need to insert a comma in there, and then I get this effect from red to blue to red to blue. But what I'm going to do now is just change these colors. So I'm going to make the 2 outside boxes, outside tiers rather, I'm going to make those pink, and the 2 inner tiers I'm going to make red, which gives that rather nice effect. So now you can start to see the potential here, but at the moment it is just a fancy looking box and we need to make it useful and usable. Now we could use the onSelect property of the HTML text box itself, but it's just as easy to overlay a button, so that's what we're going to do. Let me drag that button down and I'll cover the existing HTML box. Now, once I've done that, I'm going to remove the padding, just as I did with the HTML box itself. I'm going to make the fill transparent, so you can see the CSS underneath. I'm going to make the border black. And I'm going to change the radii at the bottom to 120, and I need to do that using the radii property up here. So radius bottom left 120, and then radius bottom right 122. Now I'm going to change the font to Courier New because I really like that font for buttons, and I'm going to change the font size to 36. Now the final piece is to change the text value of the button. There we go, and I'm going to change that to click me, but I'm going to add 2 character 10s, which are the ASCII character for a line break. So you can see that actually has the impact there of moving the text of the button up slightly so it doesn't sit completely central, which looks more effective on a button like this. Now finally I'm going to change the hover color of the text to black, and I'm going to make the hover fill transparent, and I can text that using the Alt key. There we go. So on hover the text turns black and you can still see the fancy CSS underneath. And that's it. We've built our cool 3D button, and that's how straightforward it is to create effects with CSS and its background gradient property. Now you can assign a target to the onSelect property of the button just as you would using any other button, and the HTML text box itself has X and Y properties just like the button we've overlaid on top, so you can make it all fully responsive too. So going back to the 6 buttons we saw at the beginning, all of these were created in the way I've just shown you with those 3 lines of CSS. Personally, I quite like the button colours to be symmetrical, which give a more solid definition around the button text. I also usually like to have either a gradient button on a solid background or a solid button on a gradient background, like the bottom 3 here. Too many gradients can make you feel a little seasick. So my recommendation is to try and avoid the temptation to go full on psychedelic. And a final tip before I finish, there are some great websites for CSS gradients. such as this one here with literally hundreds to choose from. But there are many others as well, so just do a Google and you'll find plenty of sites out there. So more Power Apps stuff is available on my website, hiredgun.tech, including the CSS code for the buttons you saw a few moments ago. I'll be posting more videos in this series and showing you how to animate Power Apps buttons. So if you found this video useful, please like and subscribe to the channel. So until next time, fare thee well.